to re-invite you a second time to our lecture series, especially because our students last time were you as audience favorite, and the students were very glad to hear that you're re-invited to our lecture series. And before we start, I will give you a few informations to our students because of organizational matters. And then I will introduce you, Sammy, to the audience in German before I switch back to English, and then I will give you the stage. Okay, jetzt wieder auf Deutsch, damit wir hier die organisatorischen Dinge, damit alle das verstehen auf jeden Fall. Zu Beginn wollen wir schon mal vorwarnen, dass diese Sitzung nicht auf YouTube zur Verfügung gestellt wird. Wir werden sie aber aufzeichnen und auf den Uni-Lernplattformen zur Verfügung stellen. Also für die Universität Hamburg wäre das OpenOLAT, für die HAW EMI und für die TU wäre das StatIP. Das würden wir dann so bald hochladen, sobald wir die Dateien umgewandelt haben. Das dauert manchmal leider ein paar Stündchen, aber sobald wir das haben, machen wir das. Dann haben wir noch eine Ankündigung für nächste Woche. Dirk Notz, der ja vorletzte Woche krank war, wird nächste Woche wohl seinen Vortrag halten mit einem Input der wunderbaren, lieben Inga, unserer eigenen Aktivistin, die hier auch im AStA als Referentin im Referat zur Bewältigung der Klimakrise arbeitet und die als Teil von Fridays for Future auf der COP in Glasgow war. Und dann kann sie uns da vielleicht ein paar Erlebnisberichte geben und vielleicht eigene Einschätzungen, wie das da alles abläuft. Damit würde sich halt die Vorlesung, die ja eigentlich geplant war, Indigenous Communities, verschieben. Das werden wir aber dann auch alles rechtzeitig euch sagen und vorwarnen, wo und wann und wie das stattfinden wird. Und dann gibt es noch einen dritten Punkt, den ich loswerden möchte, nämlich werden morgen die Briefwahlunterlagen für die Studis der Universität Hamburg versendet und dann seid ihr in der Lage, bis Ende Januar das Studierendenparlament zu wählen. Das ist insofern wichtig, weil das Studierendenparlament den AStA wählt. Dafür gibt es dann 22 Listen, die sich aufstellen für die Wahl. Und da findet ihr dann auch die Fridays for Future Liste. Und wenn ihr wollt, dass weiterhin tolle Sachen gemacht werden vom AStA, wie zum Beispiel diese Ringvorlesung, dann unterstützt uns doch vielleicht gerne. Dann gibt es das ähnlich an der HAW, die haben auch Wahlen zum Studierendenparlament, aber da ist es ein bisschen anders. Da müsst ihr euch vorher melden, dass die Briefwahlunterlagen gesendet werden. Sofern das gleich alles klappt, wird Eva noch gleich schreiben, an welche Mailadresse ihr das melden müsst. Aber da habt ihr dann auch irgendwie bis zum 4.1. Zeit, Unterlagen zu beantragen. Okay, soweit so gut. Und jetzt back to you, Sammy Blessing. Thank you very much for coming and listening to my German rambling. I will give you the stage now.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a little strange when you give lectures or inputs and you can't see anybody. And I know there's lots of people on the call or who are listening, streaming in, or will watch later. But if you are able to write in the chat, you are more than welcome to. While I'm speaking, if you have any questions or anything. I didn't hear Lara introduce me, but I'm sure you did. And yeah, what you may have heard is that I am a researcher and facilitator. And so most of my work is focused on bringing folks together and getting them talking and trying to inspire collective imaginations on where we're going in society and like how we are, living and coexisting with one another. So I'm super happy if you have any inputs while I'm speaking or questions and want to chime in, but basically, I am just really happy to be here and to share some thoughts with you all on food and climate change and how we will be eating in a world shaped by climate change, which is what I titled this lecture. And basically, I'm going to give a little input on what food security is and the dimensions of it, and bring in some of my thoughts as I'm talking through all of this and end with kind of some points on where and how I think we should be moving forward. And I hope you all take something from it. So yeah, let's get started. I'd say I'm going to start sharing my screen. And I'll pull up the chat just so I can see this as well. Can someone let me know if you can see what's going on here on the screen and that it looks good? I can't make it bigger than that is right now, but you can see the presentation and not my notes, right?
So we see a presentation, but we see the web address, the google.com thing.
Yeah, I don't know how to make it bigger than that.
Yeah, okay, no, that's okay. We can see everything.
Okay. Great. Then we'll get started. And cool. So food security. What is food security? So this is a definition that was found in, or that was come up with at the 1996 World Food Summit. And it basically says that food security exists when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. And yeah, that's a lot in there. And I think we will unpack it as I go through the rest of the slides and the rest of the presentation. But one thing that stuck out to me when reading this definition is that they included both dietary needs and food preferences. And I think this is significant because food preferences today are highly predicated on food marketing schemes that for decades have encouraged us as consumers to eat things that, although very delicious sometimes, are not always truly good or nutritious. And so to me, that kind of conflicts with the inclusion of dietary needs as well. So the way that we've built up our food system really doesn't lend us to have food security in the first place. And so we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a bit. There are 4 dimensions of food security that the FAO, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, has laid out. Those are availability, access, utilization, and stability. And what do we mean by all of those? First, availability. So the physical availability of food is talking about the supply side, basically how we grow our food, how we choose to use the land, the arable land and land resources that we have, so that we can produce a level of food that is sufficient for everyone on the planet. So it's talking about stock levels and also net trade. Now that food is very globalized, we're not just talking about availability nationally, but globally, and how, yeah, we are producing food. And here there's questions and debates on what the best way to do that obviously is. And there's different forms of agriculture that we'll discuss a bit later as well. But yeah, there's a debate on how is best to feed the world. And the dominant paradigm at the moment continues to be that we need large-scale agriculture in order to feed the most people. And thankfully, there's newer schools of thought that also kind of push against that and are proposing alternatives that show that there are different ways also, if we choose to prioritize it. But yes, first dimension is availability, just the general act of producing food. But just because food is available doesn't necessarily mean that it's accessible. And so the second dimension is access. And yeah, this is that there's an adequate supply, not only at national, but at international levels as well. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that translates to household food security, because access really relates to someone's ability to buy the food that's there. So here we're really talking about policy issues that focus on incomes, expenditures, markets, and prices. And that comes down to looking at it through an intersectional approach, because there's many compounding factors that may dictate why someone does not have access to good and nutritious food. And that changes in every different context, right? In the US, there is a term called food deserts that you may have heard of before. A food desert is a place where access to good, fresh, nutritious food is lacking. Food deserts in the United States looks like places that have more liquor stores than grocery stores, or places that you must drive miles to get fresh food. And those exist today, even though this conversation's been going on for quite some time. But it also exists in places like Berlin or Brandenburg. And I will focus on Berlin a lot because that's where I'm based, and where my work most recently has been focused on. But yeah, it exists in places like this as well. Berlin is a pretty good city in terms of walkability to a grocery store. But when you get a little bit outside the ring, you start to see that there's places that are lacking. And in Brandenburg, even though it's an agricultural area, there are places where people are buying their food from supermarkets and the cheapest items are potentially a piece of meat rather than something fresh, fresh produce. That also could be considered a food desert or a food security issue. The third dimension is utilization. And this is really focused on the ability for our bodies to, make the most of the nutrients that are found in our food. And this is a result of good care and feeding practices, the ability to prepare our food in the right way, and the diversity of a diet that one has within their household and in their community. So access also needs to be access to a diverse amount of food or variety of food, right? So that we can use those nutrients best. And the way that our food system, again, is set up does not necessarily lead to this. And lastly, stability. All of the dimensions must be stable over time for food security to exist in a society. And even if your food intake is adequate today, it's still possible to be considered food insecure if it fluctuates throughout the week or the month. And this also has to do with the supply chain, which is why I chose this graphic here, which I really love. It's by someone named Rahul Kamath from the Design Lab. And it's really kind of a parody because it's showing all of these different processes that food sometimes goes through in our industrial food system. It's supposed to be more of a joke, but in some cases it's like this, that it moves from all these places, and a more resilient food system could potentially be shorter. The supply chain is shorter there. And it also, a food chain, a supply chain like this also comes with many different areas where complications can exist. So the supply chain can be affected by adverse weather conditions, by political instability, economic factors like unemployment or rising food prices, or by a global pandemic, which we all just observed with COVID. So stability is a big part of food security as well. And we learned during the pandemic that can happen in an instant. And so that's been pushing a lot of people to think more about where our food comes from and how we can better source it, which I think at least is one positive. So the question I asked though is, how do we get here? How did we get here? And this is a reflection on what our globalized food system looks like today. From very agricultural societies, as we were in the past, we've become very urbanized. In fact, since 2007, more of us have lived in cities than in rural communities, and the number is growing. I thought I heard someone, and you're welcome to jump in if you'd like as well. So since from very agricultural societies where there was many more hands involved in feeding our communities, we have become more urbanized. So we are societies of consumers that live in cities and rely on people elsewhere, farmers elsewhere, who are highly unknown and undervalued to feed us and sustain us. And this is largely due to the Green Revolution, which, due to increased chemical fertilizers, more mechanization, select and hybrid crops, as well as the application of certain business strategies, has allowed us to produce much more food, while also decreasing the amount of labor that's needed on our fields. The beginnings of the Green Revolution is often attributed to a man named Norman Borlaug. He was an American scientist that was interested in agriculture and was doing research in Mexico when he developed a new disease-resistant high-yield variety of wheat. The crops that Borlaug and his colleagues developed were all domesticated plants bred specifically to respond to fertilizers and produce increased amount of grain per hectare planted. And this grew in importance, obviously, after World War II, but also into the 60s while it spread to Asia and other regions. And where and when the Green Revolution caught on, you can see in the data that coincides with an increase in more urban populations because less and less people were needed on the fields. In fact, the number of people involved in agriculture was included in the United Nations Human Development Index, which if you've studied development in any way, you've probably heard of. The Human Development Index is an indicator of how developed certain societies are. And one indicator is agriculture. And the higher the number of people in agriculture, the least developed a country is said to be. And that says a lot about the way that we value agriculture and the people who work in it, the people who feed us. So while there's many pros of the Green Revolution, of course, we learned a lot about growing food. We're able to feed and grow more food and feed more and more people. We learned better irrigation techniques that allowed us to farm in new places. There's also something to say about the distinction of science that someone like Borlaug studied from crop knowledge, which is a science in and of itself. Again, many pros, and I don't want to deny them, but this focus has led us to depend on fertilizers, which is dangerous, both for human and environmental health. It has also, another problematic aspect also of the Green Revolution is that it's prioritized certain crops over others. So the world has over 8,000 edible plants. There's so much variety out there, but our diets overwhelmingly focus on, or the 80% of our calories come from just 10 crops. And that includes the 3 you see on the screen right now. That's rice, maize, and wheat, which alone, those 3, provide nearly 60% of most people's diets. And this lack of genetic diversity in our diets directly affects the utilization dimension of food security, as I was talking about before. Most of the food we can find in our supermarkets, which is where the majority of consumers in cities, therefore most humans, source their food, is filled with different variations of these 3 same crops. So unless consumers have the food literacy, which is an important term that I'll talk more about later, unless they have the food literacy to decipher what is in their food and how they plan their meals, many of us are not eating a diet that is best for us. And this is problematic. The consequences of this globalized food system then is many things. Some of them I've listed here on the screen. A huge disconnect from food and the way our food is produced. That's mostly for people in cities, of course, but also from nature in general. And it kind of allows people to overlook this huge process behind this very integral part of our lives. And I don't put that blame on anyone, but it is a reality. So a huge disconnect from food, which leads to this low dietary diversity, which leads to caloric insufficiency. And this has been noted as one of the leading drivers of disease worldwide, preventable food diseases. There also another consequence is that although we grow enough food to feed everyone on Earth, people still go hungry, over 800 million people. And there's a new report that says 50% of the world population is either micronutrient deficient or overweight, which is a result of distribution, political choices, and again, poor food literacy in some cases. The way that we grow most of these food, especially these 3 major crops that I mentioned, is through monocultures, which leaves us very vulnerable, especially in the face of climate change. This vulnerability is, in fact, one of the biggest issues when it comes to climate justice, because it relates, in my opinion, to the insistence to rely on new technology. So new plant and seed technologies, for example. In another case, it might be new technologies that suck carbon out of the earth, out of the air, or electric things that are great, but where are we going to get those resources from? So this idea of climate justice in terms of continuously looking for new technological fixes instead of taking a hard look at our habits and how we built our societies, yeah, again, is a big climate justice issue and relatable here, in my opinion, as well. So I included this chart here just to make a point about where we're looking at, because climate change is a huge issue. I'm sure you all are aware. Lots of people working on different aspects of climate action and climate work within the movement. And I included this because our world in data is a great resource. And they made a point of saying that even if we stopped emissions from fossil fuels, because as you see, energy is taking up most of this pie at the moment, even if we stopped emissions from fossil fuels right now, emissions from food production alone would take us well beyond the carbon budget of 1.5 degrees and leave little room to reach our 2-degree target as well. But they say that we cannot fall into a false economy of the two. We have to be tackling both at the same time. And so I wanted to include that here, although I initially had this one up and was just going to show this. This is from the Project Drawdown project, if anyone's familiar with it. They have a great resource on their website called Climate Solutions 101, where there's like 6 or so chapters, I think, that goes through all the different parts of the climate problem at the moment. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you check it out. But they use a map like this, and here in industry and transport is not included as part of electricity. So basically the 2 biggest areas that produce carbon are electricity at 24% and food and agriculture that you see here on the screen. And I like the way they break it down here so you can see where the emissions are coming from. But all I wanted to talk about on this slide really was the challenges to our global food system. And one of the biggest ones, especially for people living in cities, is food waste. 52% of the weight of the food wasted in our world, which totally is like 1/3. We waste 1/3 of our food, and in more developed or overdeveloped, I like to say, societies, wealthier societies, 52% of that is generated in private households. So a big part of food system in climate change is food waste. Another big challenge is growing wealth and changing food preferences, because with wealth comes the preference to eat more dairy and meat. And as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, along with food waste, eating less meat in our societies is probably 2 of the biggest climate actions you can do. Another challenge to the food system is climate change, of course, because we're going to be facing more instances of water shortages, more droughts, more floods, and new diseases that our farmers are not necessarily prepared to deal with, or that our crops and these monocultures are posed to deal with. And on top of that, we have a loss of interest in farming. So not only were they not needed, over time, over generations, it's the dominant paradigm is that agriculture is a poor man's job. It is something that you do if you're not educated. When in reality, farming is such a specialized career. It's something, farmers know so much about crops, about land, about science, about everything that they have to integrate into running their business. And so, yeah, that dominant paradigm is just very unfortunate, because it has allowed generations of us to feel like that wasn't something we might want to do. And so, yeah, it's time to potentially try to turn that around. So yeah, I wanted to include this slide as well on how we can reduce global emissions from our food. You can see there at the top, again, the first one is higher yields. And I'll talk about in a bit how we can do higher yields, right? Because there's lots of talk about intensive farming. We need intensive farming in order to feed the world. And I've been happy to see some of the language from the bigger institutions switch to that instead of we need to produce more food, because like I said, we grow enough food in the world to feed people. It's just that it's wasted and political decisions make it not accessible to certain people. So it's not a matter of food production. But this intensity can look different to different people, right? There can be intensity on huge spaces, or there can be a more ecological plan for a farm that could potentially grow more food. And I think there's lots of inspiration out there for us to potentially look at the latter with a little bit more intensity. So I just want to show this. The second one is obviously half food waste, and then healthy calories as well. And that all kind of relates to a food system that is more ecologically resilient and socially sustainable. And yeah, I'll give some more examples in a bit. But generally, another thing that Our World in Data has stated on their website and through their research is making clear the false statement that so much of the carbon emissions from the food sector is from transport. I don't know if anyone has heard that before, but that tends to be something talked about a lot. And actually, if you want to reduce your carbon footprint, this is what the researchers say, focus on what you eat, not whether your food is local. I think that's really important. Although I focus on local food systems a lot, it's not necessarily because of the carbon emissions of food transport. It's more because of what comes when you invest in a local economy and invest in the people around you more than this transport. So this is important. And I bring this up now because climate change is happening. It is already happening. And this map is from a study that was looking on how agriculture will change over time, and basically was stating that places that right now can't grow as much will be able to grow more in the future, and places that produce a lot of the food at the moment will start to not be able to produce as much moving forward. It will be hotter, there will be more droughts and floods, and those people who are currently farming in those places will have to farm differently or move. They'll be displaced. And so it becomes a climate justice issue, of course. And we'll also just have to be shifting what we eat. We'll be shifting where we grow what we eat, potentially what we grow. And so there's lots, right now is like a really important time to be thinking about how we are engaging with our farmers, engaging with one another, to think about how and what we want to eat in a world that's shaped by climate change. So yeah, although there was an article recently in The Guardian as well that stated that although a few staple crops like soybean will do better in a warmer climate, most of them will not. Most of the key crops that we're used to at the moment will not. And so, yeah, we really will have to rethink what we're doing about what we grow and how we eat and what we're used to. Yeah, I'll leave it there. So, like I said, most of my work right now has been focused on Berlin and Brandenburg. So I want to give some examples of what that can potentially look like. And the reason I focused on Berlin is because I live there, obviously, but also because I've always thought it was such an interesting example of a city that is literally a little island in the middle of all this agricultural land. And so I'm curious as to how it can be an example of a more resilient food system. Berlin obtains only about 15% of its food from its surrounding area. And the farmers there produce more for the world market than for the capital itself. And they feed engines and biogas plants and farm animals rather than people. So there's definitely potential, should we choose to switch production in some ways. And there are very inspiring people doing that. This is really what I've been focused on in the last few months. I've been working on a podcast project called Food in My Keats. And this project is all about engaging in dialogue with people, bringing community members together, inspiring them to be curious about one another and the food that's present in our neighborhoods. And talking about what a more ecologically resilient and socially sustainable food system looks like. And so I'll be pulling out a bit of what I've been talking with people about and what I've been encouraging people to look at. One is trying to figure out people's understanding of the industrial food system. Maybe you've seen this map before. It's from a 2014, which is quite old now, but it hasn't changed much since, study by Oxfam that was called Behind the Brands. They looked into, I think, 8 or 10. Yeah, they came out with the fact that 10 or so major companies dictate how and what we typically eat. And I was curious to know how much people were aware of this, because like I said, most of us get our food from the supermarket, and the supermarket is filled with products that are a variation of these 3 crops. And although there's lots of push for more transparency in our food systems and different ways that people are trying to bring that transparency to consumers, it's still quite overwhelming to go in the store or just to source your food in a way that you're sure about and feel good about, unless you're in direct contact with your farmer. And Berlin just came out with a great report. It's called Berlin isst anders. Berlin eats differently. And it has a lot of great information in there, including the fact that Berlin could feed itself for just 3 days on food available in the city currently. 3 days. And Berlin's not alone in that. That many European cities are the same. Without supplies from the outside, the shelves in supermarkets would be bare within 72 hours, it says. The inner city warehouses are cleared. The restaurants would also have to close down for lack of supplies, and that's without Corona and hoarding purchases. So that's just a normal day in a city. But if Berlin was to draw a radius around itself, 100 kilometers, this would be enough to supply the capital plus the surrounding region with food. And I thought that was a very interesting fact to consider and to kind of bring conversation around. And I do that through a lens of food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is a term that I attribute to a group called La Via Campesina, because they kind of championed it in terms of moving it around the world. La Via Campesina is a peasants farmer network that has branches all over the world, as well in Berlin. And in 2007, in February, Mali, 500 delegates from 5 countries or continents representing all sectors of society with an interest in agricultural and food issues met and came up with this definition of food security, of food sovereignty, which is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agriculture systems. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of the food system and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. So when I read that, I think of food autonomy. I think of autonomy in general. I think of the ability for us all to make decisions with good information and make decisions that we feel are best for us. And the way that the food system is set up doesn't always allow us to do that. Food is such an integral part of our everyday lives. To me, it's something that brings me together with my community, with my friends. I love getting together around food. So that's kind of why I choose to focus on it, because I think at the core of the climate justice movement is the need for us to reconnect with one another. And all other issues could potentially stem from that. But our reality is that we have created very individualistic societies where people are just trying to survive capitalism and survive their days and get their work done without going crazy. And I think a big part of our activism and moving forward is to give space for us to be with one another and dream a little bit. That's why I work on collective imaginations. And I think doing that through food is very purposeful, valuable for me, and can bring a lot of people together. But we need to have autonomy in it. And so that's why I try to use and focus on an approach through food sovereignty. So some pathways toward a more sovereign food system. There's 5 of them that I've outlined at the moment, and I'm going to give you some examples of them. The first is land rights and land back movements, which in other presentations I talk about that from a BIPOC perspective, and the fact that Black folks around the world have been systematically divorced from land. And that's a particularly poor and frustrating issue, but land back issues are happening all over the world. People are fighting for their land all over, and also in Brandenburg. Permaculture and agroecology, I'll talk about a bit. The true cost of food, which you may have heard of before, and if not, I'm happy to introduce it today, which leads into local economies. And lastly, but definitely not least important, is food education and literacy. So let's have a look. Land rights. So land rights is a really big issue when we're talking about food and agriculture, especially in climate change, because like I said about those 10 companies, they're huge and they dictate how we grow and source our food because they have the power to, which means they also dictate the land, or they have the power to dictate how their supply chain functions. And that's what that whole Behind the Brands campaign was about highlighting the transparency in these systems and ensuring that every aspect was as sustainable and just as possible. But when people don't have the right to their land, there's less incentive to take care of it in the long term, because it could be taken away from them in any second. So here is this picture that you're seeing is a depiction of the CAP system. The CAP is the Common Agricultural Policy of the EU. And if you are familiar with food and agriculture, you're probably familiar with the debates going on around it and the push for a restructuring of the CAP that prioritizes farms and farm type rather than farm size. Because at the moment, the EU's agricultural subsidies mainly support agro industries, which are huge farms with huge areas and huge machines and less labor. So this picture is basically depicting the money from the CAP going to the bigger farmer than the smaller farmers. Many of these big farms are run by investors who are more distant from agriculture, such as a furniture company called Steinhoff Familienholden and something called the Lindhorst Group, which is active in real estate and care. So yeah, a lot of the big holders in Brandenburg as well are not necessarily farmers. And yeah, so there's even a quote by the former environmental minister, that's Julia Klukne, that said, if consumers want regional, they have to buy regional. If they want organic, they have to buy organic, which is a horrible statement for a politician to state, because that puts all the onus on a consumer rather than taking the responsibility for the power to change that as a politician, because what we need is for these subsidies to be redirected. Yeah. So there's a bit of that. And there are many groups in Berlin and Brandenburg and around Germany working to readdress that, or to address it and to restructure it. Some of them you see here on the screen. And ABL down there on the right is the one I'm most familiar with, and who is the Berlin Brandenburg branch of La Via Campesina. Yeah, and so what we need really is to be in collaboration with these people and these groups. Generally, across the climate justice movement, we need to be connecting struggles and, yeah, connecting the issues that impassion us the most. I remember at the big climate march that happened, I guess it was earlier this year now, there was very little people at the agricultural sector, and I was so disappointed by that. But I think what really happens in Berlin is the agricultural protests and demos happen in January. So I'm happy to be talking to you now. And if this inspires you at all, make sure that you connect with groups like Veganism, I think it is, Veganism, and others who are planning a lot of demos for January. And yeah, we need to be supporting that with our votes and our political demands. The second pathway is permaculture and agroecology. And I left this slide in from talks I usually give on climate justice, because this idea of deconstructing binaries, I think, is also relevant when we talk about how we want to do agriculture. I talked about a bit about this in the beginning, but essentially that the way that Western thought has Western thought has placed on many societies this binary between certain things, between Black and white, between woman and man, between human and nature, civilized and uncivilized. And that dichotomy, this binary, is really, it's really destructive. It's not very productive when it comes to agriculture either. We tend to separate humans from agriculture, or not from agriculture, but from nature, and to separate agriculture from nature. And that's problematic because agriculture is nature. It's just it's a controlled nature in a way. But there's lots that I think that we can learn from allowing nature to teach us. And that's kind of what permaculture and agroecology tries to do. And these terms are something that are growing in popularity these days by new age farmers, but are practices that our indigenous ancestors have practiced for millennia. It's the same techniques that have been talked about and ignored, but are now being returned to. And I think it's important to remember always where these roots come from, which is why I still included this slide. This one depicts different types of agriculture. And I like it a lot because Germany, Berlin especially, Berlin is like known as like an organic capital, I guess. People have been saying this. In Germany, Germans in general have been demanding more organic food and also more transparency in the food system, which is great. But a push for organic is not the end all, right? What you see here on the screen is an organic farm on the left, and on the right-hand side is a permaculture farm or an ecological farm. And you see that there's much more integration of every part of life in different forms of life and biodiversity versus organic, which is great for the soil and produces great food. But we could start to think of our food systems a little bit more integrated like this, and I think we should. Yeah, in Brandenburg, the soils are quite sandy and are said to not yield much. This is why large estates were established not only in the GDR, but hundreds of years ago. And even today, large farms dominate with like 240 hectares compared to a national average of 63. So there's huge farms out there, definitely. Rainfall is comparatively low. Droughts have become more frequent in the recent years. And 80% of Brandenburg's agricultural land has been considered disadvantaged since 2018. This is from the same report, the Berlin Standards report. But yeah, even though 13% of Brandenburg's farms are managed ecologically, like what you see here on the screen, there are pushes to increase that to 20% by 2024. And I think there has to be more discussion on describing any sort of land as dead or disadvantaged. Maybe it just hasn't been engaged with in the right way yet, because there's plenty of examples of lots of food growing in places in Brandenburg, but around the world as well. And one example of that, which I love to show, is a friend of mine in Malawi. So he, in 2018, acquired some land from his family, which is typical there. And it looked like this. And he immediately started implementing permaculture techniques and developed something called the Permaculture Paradise Institute in Malawi. And Malawi, which is why I included this example, is Malawi is known for very poor and sandy soils like Brandenburg. But after just a couple of years, this is what that same area looks like. And if you follow Permaculture Paradise Institute on Facebook, he posts all of this amazing food that he grows all the time. Yes, the climate is completely different in Malawi than Brandenburg. But like I said, climates are changing. Brandenburg is going to be able to grow different things in the coming years. And I think there needs to be more support for farmers to have land rights, but also to experiment and grow food differently than what they've been forced to produce for the past decades. And if we are able to do that, I think there's lots of potential to grow much more and much different food than we currently have. Yeah. There's also lots of other examples here that I could potentially bring up, but I'm going to leave them for now. We can talk about them later if you'd like. The third pathway is true cost accounting. And this is the idea of accounting for all the externalities that are involved in any sort of production. So true cost accounting can happen for anything, but the true cost of food is accounting for the externalities that are involved in our food system. So when you go to a grocery store and you see something that seems cheap, is it really cheap, or are you only paying for a certain aspect of it at the grocery store? This is the idea of true cost, that this peach that you want in the dead of winter or just out of season, that you're paying for. Are you paying also for the electricity and the transport and whatever got it to you, as well as, the resources used to produce that in the first place? Right now, a lot of our food is not priced correctly. And that's a difficult thing to deal with in places that are food poor, for example. Food poor means that you may have availability, but you don't have access, again. Or places that are very price sensitive. And Germans in general, or Germany in general, especially Berlin, are very price sensitive places. People spend less on food in Germany than they do in the rest of the EU. And that makes it difficult to try to adjust cost appropriately. And it's something that we're all going to have to discuss and debate and figure out together, because we're going to have to start paying more for food. So what would that mean for the rest of the things we pay for? In the project I've been working on, Food My Keats, I talk a lot about the need for us to join struggles, for example, with the rent struggles, the housing struggles, because all of these things should be combined in the way that we think about well-being in the city. So true cost accounting. And true cost accounting for me also relates to the support of local agriculture and different groups that are doing, for example, Zolavis, which is solidarity agriculture. In the US, we call it community supported agriculture. And I connect this to true cost because in these sort of systems, we are paying what the farmers have negotiated and have said are fair prices for them. And collectively, we are helping them achieve a income and livelihood that is sufficient for them. And in return, we get fresh seasonal produce all year round. And there's a bit of food education that's involved in this pathway as well, because many people in the city find that these programs are expensive. But I think when you break it down, you see that it's not necessarily so much. People also have the impression that you don't get anything else but potatoes during the winter. And that's also very much not true. I volunteered a lot with Plant Age, and they have a great bounty for the winter. My most recent one was with Speisegut, which is the smallest organic farm, I think they might be the smallest, but they're also the closest to the city border. So supporting solabis and different forms of local agriculture like this are part of true cost, but also part of local economies, which is also one of the pathways. Because if we are supporting local agriculture like this, it can be one aspect of a bigger local economy that I think is very important to think about moving forward. And I just highlight circles here as one example in Berlin that is trying to push a basic income and a more local currency on the blockchain in Berlin. They have a few restaurants and stores that are part of it. And then it's an interesting example of trying to create a more local economy through a local currency. And there's different examples of that around the world. Maybe some of you know of them. I think it's an interesting thing to look at, especially with food, so that we can keep track of where food's coming from and how that value is being generated more locally. The last pathway is food education or food literacy. The first one is food literacy. So here on the screen, you see some examples that I talk about in podcasts, for example. Foraging. So I know it's a very popular thing in Germany, is to forage at certain times of the years for mushrooms or different things. And I think if you've ever joined a foraging tour, or that's something you've done in your families for traditionally, you know that brings a lot, at least for me, it brings a lot of joy in just identifying things and knowing them. After my first foraging trip, it was so cool to walk around the city and even see some edible plants that I just ignored before. And I think it would be very important to get more people involved in just knowing what these things are and that they're around us, so that we feel more connected to the natural world around us. And that sort of connection and curiosity leads to the middle photo, which is an example of pickling or fermentation. It's a form of food preservation that I think is really important and something we should reconnect to, especially if we are to produce more food locally and have more bounty in the summer. This idea of preserving it for the wintertime is really cool and fun and really gives a lot of power back to the consumer. And the last picture is just something that I included because I love it. It's a depiction of nature, which has deep, deep roots, and agriculture, which doesn't really give back to the soil and all these micronutrient root systems as nature does. And it's important to see that distinction. And if people understood that more, potentially, that value would extend to how we grow and the type of agriculture, and just kind of being more interested in it. There's a couple things going on in Berlin that are exciting to think and talk about. One is one of the newest food delivery services called Bino. It's started by two French women who moved here with their moved to Berlin with their families, and found it very hard to find where the best food was and how to source it. And so they started this very cool food delivery service where once a week they provide ingredients for a 2-person meal, sourced from farmers within 50 kilometers of the city. It's all low waste, comes with everything's put into packets or like glass jars. An egg comes in one little egg carton in order to, with a recipe so you can make a local meal each week. And they do a lot of good food education work in the city with young people, with business teams, teaching people seasonality of food preparation. And I think that's really, really positive. On the other side, you see the Keats Farm, which is a concept that's based in urban agriculture and hydroponic systems. The idea that we can and should be considering what food we can grow in an urban setting so that we can combine that with what's possible outside and more rural areas. And a Keats Farm concept is something that combines education with hands-on working to understand how food is grown and transported and moved around a city. And the idea is for those to be in mini Keatses. It's a similar idea to the Berlin Food Council's Lebensmittelpunkte, which is now being developed into a bigger concept to have Lebensmittelpunkte in every Keats in the city. And this can be a cafe that starts up as a Lebensmittelpunkte, or a restaurant after hours, or a bookstore. And it can be any sort of place that wants to be a Lebensmittelpunkte. And so that can be a place where Solavi projects drop off their food boxes, their veggie boxes. It can be a place with a kitchen that teaches the community food preparation techniques, or just has community dinners. It's an idea of having a place in the city where people can come together and eat and talk about food and talk about the food system. And I think having more and more places like that is a big part of building a more resilient food system. Yeah. Whew. So those are the 5 pathways. I hope one of them was inspiring. I hope that some of that information sticks with you. This is a poster that I had for one of the demos I joined with Alle and other agricultural folks with the collective I'm part of, Black Earth, which is a BIPOC environmental justice collective in Berlin. Food sovereignty is climate justice. And should you have any questions, I'd be so happy to hear from you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your presentation. Food security is a very important topic, and I really appreciated your call for community and the idea of food walks in the city. I think that's maybe a nice concept to bring farming to the cities, to the urban settings. We have many questions in our FNQ. And for transparency, we are collecting these questions of our students in a Google Doc, and we are sorting them by topic. And we will ask them cluster by cluster, but because you said you're interested in discussions and also in discussions with the students themselves, I'd like to invite every student to raise their hands if they like, to ask their question in person or give some commentary if they like.
And if they want to ask in German and then you translate, for example,
that's also okay. Yeah, you can, also wenn ihr mögt, könnt ihr die Fragen auch auf Deutsch stellen, so. Und dann übersetze ich gerne auch die Fragen. Just raise your hand. Ihr müsst euch einfach nur melden, and then we will unmute you. Wir werden euch das Mikro freischalten. Okay. But I will begin with our first. So no, Lorenz has a question, so I will have to. Okay, I hope some of my co-hosts maybe can help me with the Stummschaltung.
Hello?
Yeah, hello.
Okay, hi Sammy. That was great. I have a big question, and I have heard and seen often that Nestle is a very bad company. For example, they take the water out of some, I think, African countries and sell it back to the local people. And I always think I don't want to support Nestle or other companies, but what companies are actually good?
Lawrence, that's a great question. It's a great question. Yeah. I wish I could just rattle off all the companies that you could focus on. I mean, the problem is that the global food supply chain is very opaque. It's not transparent at all. Yeah. So initiatives like the one I talked about, Behind the Brands, and other independent researchers are looking into that. But often the suppliers that feed into those supply chains, they themselves are not as transparent, or they don't even have the answers. So it's hard for the parent company like Nestle, even when they say they want to go back and do that. So it's just it's a process of doing that research, unfortunately, at this point. And so the companies that you want to focus on are the ones that are the ones that are more shorter supply chains. And I'm sorry, there's not a better answer for that. Nestle has made, since that Oxfam thing, Nestle has made some changes to their supply chain, but by and large, they're still a huge company that is able to hide a lot of the processes in their supply chain. So you can never be so sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I was waiting for maybe another raised hand, but if not so, I would start with the first cluster. The first cluster would be social justice. And the question is, it's concerning food sovereignty. And the question is, how is this concept also relevant in the global north? How do race, class come in there?
Yeah. So like I said, I interpret food sovereignty as a process of establishing more autonomy in our food systems in every sort of way. And so autonomy is also very relevant in the global north. Our ability to say what we want and be sure that we're getting this is something that we also struggle with, right? And race and class comes into that because although there is a global issue of injustice between the so-called global north and global south, there's also many wealth disparities, socioeconomic disparities in countries as well, in Germany as well, in Berlin as well. And so, although it's less pronounced in a place like Germany, or maybe just not as reported, because only recently has the African census even come out to show us how many Black folks live in Germany. It's a growing conversation. You will see that, we also are dealing with climate migrants who by and large are people of color. And so that's where race and class comes in, because these people are going to be joining our societies and are not yet being accepted in a way that is justifiable in the terms of climate justice. So I think that's what I was trying to mention in terms of how food will change, how agriculture will change, will also relate to how people are moving around the world so that they can survive and live in the world. And I think we have to be more cognizant of those needs and those pushes as we talk about how to welcome people into our societies. And yeah, I think no matter where we look, the class issue is a problem. I mean, also in Berlin, who is shopping, who has the ability to shop at certain stores or do the Zolavis or whatnot. So a lot of my conversations also have been in the Zolavi network on how we can have more inclusivity. And I think not yet is there the intention to go out and meet people where they are at. We're still in a position where these really cool projects are expecting people to come to them. And so that's something we have to think about. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have another question to social justice. Do you know any NGOs that help indigenous people to protect their land, so if it won't be sold to companies to grow crops, for example, for soy in the meat industry, that we could support? Yeah.
NGOs that are supporting frontline indigenous communities who are growing food. This is the question, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's a great question. And not off the top of my head, no. NGOs, big NGOs, no, I don't. But let me make a note of that. And should I come up with them, I will send them to you all. Yeah.
And just a side note, I think Franziska just posted a link to the Afro census you mentioned in your answer beforehand.
I saw that, yeah. Thank you, Franziska.
The next cluster would be meat and veganism. Do you see any generational shifts happening in items of plant-based diets?
Can you say the first part of the question?
Do you see generational shifts happening in terms of plant-based diets? So,
yeah,
I think generational.
Yeah, intergeneration. You said something before that, but yes, okay, yes, definitely. I mean, young people in Germany are eating more vegan diets in general, right? It's like growing. Berlin is a vegan capital city. It's so easy to eat there. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I'm currently in Arizona in the United States visiting my family. And yeah, people eat meat here all the time. It is crazy. And there's really not so much options when you go out. So it's been very hard to see that, and to see the like cognitive dissonance of people, which is still very present in Germany as well, right? Like especially older generations, we all know that we need to eat less meat, but there's a true cognitive dissonance on someone's personal responsibility for that. That same report that I keep quoting from really has so much great information packed in there. And they said that although more and more people are identifying as vegetarians or even vegans, there's also a huge amount of people who overestimate, like people who say that they only eat meat once in a while. That tends to be a huge overestimation, and they eat meat 70% more than they actually say they do or think they do. So yeah, people are like, oh, just once in a while. They probably have it once, maybe twice a week, and they're thinking they're just eating it once a month. So that's something to look out for. But yes, I do see intergenerational changes. Like I said, young people in Germany are definitely eating less meat than their parents or grandparents. And in the United States, also, I'm living with my dad right now, staying with him for a second, and he is a meat. He must have like meat, or not even like chicken or fish. He must have pork or beef all the time. And so I've been creating meals like a lentil bolognese last night. I made a lentil bolognese and didn't tell him that there was not meat in it. And after he finished, I said, so did you like it? And he said, yeah, it was great. And I was like, you didn't miss the meat at all? And he was like, there wasn't meat in there? And I was like, yes, I won, you know. We also did Beyond Beef burgers like last week. So little by little, you know, it's just, it's a very psychosomatic thing that people feel like they need meat. So the way to do that, it's why these alternative meats, although I'm not a huge fan of them, are super important for the food economy, because we need to be able to shift people from this very long push towards you need meat, you need protein, right? So
yeah, that's very funny, because my father would never eat. Well, now he does, but when I was younger, when I was still living at home, he used to eat my vegetarian alternatives of meat, and he didn't know. And well, it tasted good, but he would never do it consciously.
Yeah, like I can't make him something just with veggies and a grain. Like he'll be like, where's the meat? But if I make something that seems like it, then he won't question it. So.
Yeah. We had another question to veganism and maybe vegetarianism in oh god, I have to translate it on the top of my head. How it translates to our carbon footprint. So if we are vegan, would it really oh, I'm sorry, people are entering this room.
So maybe the question is, does it really have that big of an impact? Yes. Let me try to pull it up. Let me try to pull it up so I can share a link with you. But like I said, Our World in Data, if you have not looked at Our World in Data, they have like very recent studies on taking all this research from different researchers and putting it together and stating like, you know, that we've been hearing this a long time, but this is exactly what's right. And I'm pretty sure I would need to look it up again to make sure that that's what they say as well. But yes, eating meat is the biggest thing, especially for those of us who live in overdeveloped countries like this. Eating less meat and not eating or not wasting food. Those are the two biggest things you can do. And I work right now for a group called Stay Grounded. They work on reducing aviation. And it's like my part-time job. And even that, like even one-way flights sometimes are less than eating meat out of your whole diet. So yes, this is a big part of, and it's not asking everyone to be a vegan. It's asking everyone to reduce meat in their everyday lives. So once a month, potentially.
Well, that's a good transition to the next question. The next question is, are meat alternatives better for our food systems? And they're like in brackets, is it an environmental cautious answer to meat production?
So like I said, I mean, I think there's lots to be said about food education and food literacy when it comes to this question, because I think people are scared to switch to a vegetarian or vegan diet because they don't know how to feed themselves. And so then they get hungry and they're like, I can't do this. But if we knew how to feed ourselves better, we would be eating less because we would be eating more micronutrient packed food. So that's one part of that answer. The other part, like I mentioned before, is that we have a culture, a global culture, and a growing one, why people who are making more money now are wanting to eat more meat and dairy. And so, yeah, it's a status thing. That's something we have to fight, but also people are so ingrained to need it. They think they must have it as part of their plate. So for those people, you can't just tell them not to eat it. It's just not possible. And so the money being pumped into meat alternatives is for those eaters, the people who feel like they have to have it as part of their meal, and to transition them once in a while. So like if you can transition a fake chicken 2 or 3 times a week, that is so much better than that person eating that chicken every week. And because there's so much money being pumped into it, the original ones were so high in sodium and so nutritionally deficient, honestly, that we really shouldn't have been promoting them so much. But now so much money and research is being pushed into them, they are getting better. And so I do think that they're an important part of our food system for the folks who are having a hard time transitioning.
Thank you. The next cluster is the current state. And we have a big question. How is COVID influencing food security around the world? Do we have even an answer for that?
Yeah, I do, and not in so much detail maybe, but I mean, maybe you've heard about these situations of boats, of cargo ships being stuck at port, right? And not being come in. So like, yeah, it's affecting our food system. I haven't looked into it so hard, to be honest. But it definitely is affecting it in some way. It's also affecting it just because in the thick of it, when we were all like panic buying everything, all the things, we saw that there was bare shelves, and we saw that like that doesn't feel good. Panicking about having food and necessities doesn't feel safe, right? And so people started to reach out to their local farmers, and there was a huge increase in people sourcing directly from farmers in places like Berlin, for example, but other places as well. And so I think that it has left a lasting impression on many consumers, at least those who are financially privileged to do so, to make better choices. I think it's left a lasting impression on them to want to know more about where their food is coming from, especially because of the racist paradigm of like food's coming from China and we can't eat Chinese food and things like this. Is very racist. But I mean, it has forced people to think more about where their food's coming from. And yeah, it's like shitty that it's that reason, but also good that people are questioning it, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I think you have answered the next question, but I want to be inclusive and still ask the question. Is Germany different from other European countries in terms of producing and handling food? Statistics say that food is much cheaper in Germany than in many other parts of Europe. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have answered it when I talked about Germans' unwillingness to pay more for food, right? This has been reported many times that Germany is the country that pays least for its food, or pays the least of our income towards food. So other countries spend much more of their income on food, you know, like Italy and France, they have a food culture that is just so much stronger than the Germans do, you know? And I love me a good German meal, but like, yeah, the German food culture is not as strong as other places. And that has been reflected in the amount of food, the amount of money that Germans people that live in Germany tend to spend on food. So yeah, while I was doing interviews for the podcast, I also talked to someone who I really trust. I trust their knowledge because they're a very smart person who reads the newspaper a lot. But they mentioned a fact that I haven't been able to corroborate yet. And I think it's because I haven't tried to search it in German either. But maybe you know that vegetable production in the EU or most places is graded. There's like grade A, grade B, grade C. And if you go volunteer on a farm, they're usually sorting them into different grades and they will go to different places. So you get better food at certain places than other places, okay? And this person that I was talking to told me that because Germans don't pay as much money for food, the food that even gets to our borders is the lowest quality food because we don't pay for it enough. So why would they even give it to us? You know? And I've been trying to corroborate that. If anybody finds it, please email me, because I honestly think that's true. Because when I go to the grocery store in Germany, that cucumber is already soft, and or I take it home and it's like done in like one day, and I'm like, what the hell is this? And I come here to the US, and granted, it's like the breadbasket. We grow a lot of food in this country, but everything is so crisp and delicious all the time. And I'm like, wow, this is crazy, this difference. Like, what is this that's happening? So I think there's lots of truth to that. And I haven't, like I said, I have not been able to find that fact written out, but the fact that we don't pay enough for food is going to affect the quality of food that we get, period. And I think it's even more so in Berlin, because everything in Berlin is cheap. And it's going to be a hard road for us to figure out what the true price of everything should be.
Okay, yeah, well, maybe you have better food because you have more sun, but I don't know.
This is possible also.
Yeah, and I know lemons in America are sweet and they're very sour here in Germany.
Yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm.
Moving on to the next cluster. This cluster is titled Solutions. And we have a question, maybe because we had a presentation on urban greening, so also gardening and vertical greening farming. And the question is, do you think urban gardening and vertical gardening are good ways to secure food security in cities?
Yeah, I think it's not going to secure food security, but it is an aspect of food security in a city, for sure. And I think I've always thought of greening and urban agriculture as much more than food production, but general well-being, because there's so many studies of greenery in our cities making us happier, more healthy people. And so, yeah, I mean, Berlin is such a green city. Most of you are all over Germany, right? You're not just in Berlin. Okay. Obviously, you're in Hamburg, actually. But anyways, I find cities, most cities in Germany, to be quite green. Berlin is too. And I think that there is potential to have more urban food forests. So yeah, I think there's already this huge tradition of like Schwerbegartens and people growing their own food. Lots of people grow food on their balconies and things like that. And so the culture is there. It's just that people don't grow so much. And I think if we prioritize that, if the city, public, government prioritize that, it could be a big part of growing more food, because along with hydroponic farming, like I talked about for a second, I think there's room for us to talk about what can be grown within the city borders versus what we can contribute to that from outside. And then we're not using land for food that could be grown already here, And I think that conversation, is imminent. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we have a question. Do you think issues about food security and the food system should be taught in school? I would add maybe at university, or do you have any idea where we could intercept the informations so people change their behavior? Do you have any ideas maybe?
as early as possible. College is way too late. University is way too late. I mean, how many of you learned about food and food production in your elementary schools, or I don't know what it's called in Germany, but primary school? I can't see any of you, but I would be surprised if many of you raised your hand for that. Yeah, I think most curriculums around the world even don't include this in their curriculums in primary school. There's lots of private initiatives that go into schools and teach that through NGOs or nonprofits, of course, and there's lots that exist in Germany as well, like Gemüsegartens and Gemüse Academy and things like that. But the earlier the better, the earlier that we teach food literacy so that people can choose their food wisely is the better. And I think in university, that's when we should really be talking about the politics of food, not just the literacy of food. So yeah, I think it should be general education for sure. I mean, just like finance and food should be part of our general education.
I have the same opinion. I think it's very important, and we should learn before it's too late. We also have in our organizations team and our organizing team, we have our own questions, and I was just asking my teammates if they want to ask their questions maybe in person, so we can interact more and we have like a discussion. But I would start with my own question. I think I have to search for it a second. I'm sorry. I don't find my question. I'm sorry. Yeah, okay, but my friend is okay. I will give her the right.
Hello. I really liked your lecture, by the way. And I was just wondering, so my uncle is like a farmer, and I find it really hard to discuss with him about food and eating meat and stuff, because I mean, it's his job. So it's very hard to convince him of not eating as much meat. And do you have any tips for that?
Well, first of all, I will say that talking to farmers, and something I really learned in the last few months as well doing the podcast project and talking to farmers, is we tend to demonize certain types of farming over others. And I think it's really important as we move forward to not demonize one side or prioritize one side or the other. Yes, I believe in certain types of farming, but all farmers are land stewards who are doing their best. I do not believe that there are evil farmers who don't care about the world and things. They are taking care of land in most cases in ways that they have been influenced and encouraged to by the government for decades. So I don't know what type of farming your uncle does. Your uncle, your grandfather, your grandfather?
My uncle, yes.
Your uncle. I don't know what type of farming he does, but most farmers have been influenced to develop and to invest in their farms in a certain way that is in line with the industrial food system. And so for them to switch now, because we're all like, oh, we need more organic food and we need more ecological farm systems, it's not easy for them to do. The cap really limits them on what they can do. And so I think talking with him, and I'm sure you've tried this, but it's really important to acknowledge all the hard work that he does. And then when it comes to eating meat, it's I haven't found the right way to do it either. But at the end of the day, people who understand the impact of meat on the climate and still choose to eat meat where they don't necessarily know where it comes from, that's really hard to deal with. But it sounds like your uncle knows where his food comes from. I guess he wants to survive, but I think farms like that have to start diversifying. They shouldn't stop meat production altogether, but an integrated system would allow him to be more resilient in the long run. And so I guess a conversation around what does it look like for him to be resilient is a more fruitful conversation if the reality is more people are eating less meat. So yeah, like what does he want to look like in years to come? What does he want his farm to look like? Yeah, I think kind of imaginations of the future is a better conversation than like, we have to stop this. Why aren't you stopping this? But what does he want then? Yeah, that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer.
Franziska, did you raise your hand? Yeah.
Yeah, actually I did. Yeah, thank you so much for covering such a huge range of issues, all centered around food sovereignty. And my question connects quite well to the one raised before. You just mentioned storytelling as a method, and I absolutely share the need to engage with especially such methods to sensitize people about food issues, but still I imagine that it's very difficult to change nutrition habits because it's just such a deeply cultural and emotionally entangled issues. So it would be wonderful if you could maybe share some thoughts on your strategies and also what you actually mean when talking about collective imagination. How does this open new avenues for thinking of different nutritional lifestyles and habits, and how does this maybe change people's minds, even if people maybe wouldn't even expect that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. This is the biggest issue with food, right? It's so hard to change people's food habits because it's such a comfort thing. A lot of us eat for enjoyment and comfort. Some of us very much don't. People just eat for nutrition and sustenance. But a lot of us eat for joy and comfort and for memory as well. And which is why I mentioned really liking to bring people together around a table and making food and making new dishes that maybe people haven't tried. And like I did with my dad, for example, it's about introducing them and doing that for them. Memory. And that happens on I know that's not like a huge thing that we can do for all of society, but you know, there are some groups of people like at these Lebensmittelpuntes, the idea is that you cook in a way that would inspire conversation around that food while people are sharing it and sharing each other and cultures and whatnot. And I think it's a very tiny way, but it is really the only way I see right now to convince people. You have to be able to try something new. Yeah, that's one. Collective imagination. What I mean by that is kind of what I was just saying before in terms of like, where do people want to go? People all have needs. We all have needs and we all have desires of how we want to live. And sometimes we are so jaded by having to just exist in this society that we were born into and chuck away at. It's hard to have space to just think and be and dream of what else it could be like, because we're just constantly trying to survive the day or the week. And so collective imaginations for me is creating space for people to just like be and think for a second. And in an ideal world, what would that look like to you? What would it look like for you to source your food or to make your food? What would you want? And if someone was to say something that is kind of an antithesis to a more ecologically resilient and socially sustainable food system, that space would also be to talk through what the consequences of that desire could potentially be and the consequences of everyone's desires on each other. So a collective imagination is the space for individuals to state what they want and need, and then to discuss how that would conflict or combine with others in the same space so that we can, have a dialogue and discussion about it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Okay, thank you. We have a lot of questions left, but maybe we could just send you a link to the Google Doc, and if you like and you feel you have free time, you could maybe answer them. But well, we are now at the end of our lecture, so we don't have any time left to ask the remaining questions.
I just shared something from Our World in Data. I don't know if this is the exact one, but you can play around with their stuff and maybe find something there if it's interesting to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing. I would like to invite you to another Zoom call to rehash this Zoom meeting, and you can give us like your commentary if it's, I don't know. If you like, you can join and we can talk about everything.
Sure, happy to. And for the person that asked about the NGOs, one came to mind. They had like a food sovereignty thing for a second. So if you want to share that, I don't know if people are still on this call. Oh yeah, they are. But they did a food sovereignty highlight of people around the world, and they might be a good one to look into. Yeah.
Thank you for the re-answering the question. We have problems sending you a link, but when after 2 seconds.
You want to send it by email? Oh, okay.
Oh yeah, by email, we can do that also. And then I would close this meeting for the rest, and we can talk in the next one.
Well, thank you everyone. It was a pleasure. Be in touch. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Danke fürs Einschalten. Nicht vergessen, die Aufnahme wird nicht auf YouTube sein, sondern auf den Lehrplattformen. Okay, dann bis next week. Hat sie es gekriegt noch? Fürs Einschalten. Nicht vergessen, die Aufnahme wird nicht auf YouTube sein, sondern auf den Lehrplattformen. Okay, dann bis next week. Hat sie